In 1839, Austin, Texas was not yet a city. It was a trading post called Waterloo, a scatter of cabins on the Colorado River, chosen as the capital of an independent republic by a president who arrived, reportedly, in the middle of a buffalo hunt. The nearest town of any size, San Antonio, sat more than 80 miles away, across ground the Comanche still considered theirs. There was no protecting fort, there was no army garrison. There was, according to the men who advised against the choice, no good reason to put a seat of government there at all. Today, that same bend in the river anchors a metropolitan region of more than 2.3 million people, headquarters to the world's most valuable electric car company, and the site of one of the largest semiconductor investments in American history, over $18 billion from a single company. On land that once had no name on any map worth trusting. The men who chose this ground were not building a city. They were making a bet against the odds of the frontier itself. And this is the story of everyone who inherited it. Chapter 1. The Frontier Capital. In the spring of 1839, the job of turning a rumor into a capital fell to one man with a transit and a rope chain. Edwin Waller was a Virginia-born lawyer and veteran of the Texas Revolution, who had signed the Texas Declaration of Independence 3 years earlier and had since made himself useful to the Republic in whatever capacity it required. He arrived on the banks of the Colorado River in January 1839, commissioned by President Mirabeau Lamar to survey a capital out of open ground, and by April he had platted a grid of 14 blocks running north from the river, its central avenue cut 120 feet wide, and aimed due north at a bare limestone hill where no building yet stood. There was no quarry supplying the stone, no mill cutting the lumber, no road connecting the site to anywhere a wagon could reliably travel. He named the avenue Congress anyway. The capital would come later. The avenue came first. That promise arrived faster than the protection did. By the fall of 1839, the town held perhaps a few hundred people, clerks, surveyors, laborers, raising the first state house out of log and clapboard, and almost nothing built to keep any of them alive. The town had raised no stockade, no fort stood within reach, and no army waited between Congress Avenue and the plains the Comanche had ridden for generations, nor had the Republic promised help would arrive before the raiders did. Through the early 1840s, the raiding parties came anyway, close enough to the edge of town that a stolen horse or a burned cabin was not news so much as weather, and close enough to the seat of government itself that clerks kept loaded rifles propped against the walls of the rooms where they drafted the Republic's laws. The frontier was never far from the ink. The danger sharpened in 1842. In March, a Mexican army column crossed the Rio Grande and occupied San Antonio, less than 80 miles to the southwest. And in the same months, Comanche raids intensified, as if the frontier itself had chosen that spring to test the young capital on two fronts at once. President Sam Houston, who had opposed Waller's choice of site from the start and said so loudly in the newspapers, decided the government's papers were safer somewhere else, and Austin's charter as capital along with them. He ordered the Texas General Land Office archives loaded onto wagons under cover of night, quietly, without a public vote or a legislative order, and sent them under guard toward the city of Houston, which bore his own name. It was, by any measure, an act of retreat dressed up as an act of administration. The citizens of Austin did not wait for a debate in the legislature. A group of armed residents, organized within hours into what history would remember as a vigilante committee, hauled out a cannon kept on the town square, loaded it, and rolled it into the road ahead of the wagons. They stopped the teamsters at gunpoint, seized back the crated documents, and stood watch over them through the night. Sleeping in shifts beside the crates, until the danger of another attempt had passed. No order had come from a soldier, no garrison stood behind them, and no law required any of it. The cannon belonged to the town, and so, they had decided, did the archives. The wagons never reached Houston. Houston never forgave the town for it, and he spent years afterward looking for another way to undo the choice Waller had staked in the dirt 3 years earlier. He never found one. The cannon went back to the square. The rifles stayed by the walls. And on the empty lots, surveyors had platted for a government that could barely feed itself, men with no interest in politics at all, land agents, cotton factors, a scattering of speculators fresh off the boat from Tennessee and Kentucky, were already beginning to count the value of ground that no bank in the Republic would yet lend against, and no cannon would ever need to defend. Chapter 2. Statehood and Stone. On December 29, 1845, the Republic Waller had staked out of open ground ceased to exist, and Austin found itself capital not of a fledgling republic, but of the 28th state, in a union that had taken 9 years to decide it wanted Texas. The town Waller platted 6 years earlier still looked more like an idea than a place. Its population held in the low thousands, thin across the grid he had drawn, more paper than pavement. Congress Avenue ran its full 120 feet, past vacant lots and half-raised storerooms, a boulevard waiting for a city large enough to deserve it. Annexation changed the letterhead. It did not change the arithmetic. For nearly 4 decades, that arithmetic scarcely moved, while the state's ambitions drifted toward richer ports and rail towns, Galveston with its harbor, Houston with its tracks, San Antonio with a history older than the Republic itself. What Austin still held was land, open acreage the legislature could hand to any institution willing to plant itself on the prairie's edge. It was on those terms, inducement dressed as honor, that the University of Texas came to sit on a rise northeast of the Capitol grounds. Its doors opened in September 1883, onto a main building still wearing its scaffolding, a half-finished pile of Victorian Gothic turrets where students sat for lectures under a roof not yet sealed against rain. No endowment funded it, no patron underwrote it, and no architect had yet finished it. The university opened anyway, because Austin, whatever else it lacked, had never once lacked ground to build on. The capital itself needed no such excuse. The state had wanted a monument since before annexation, and had simply lacked, for 40 years, the money and the material to build one. Both arrived together in July 1885, out of a granite quarry on a rise near Marble Falls that 3 Texas landowners, George W. Lacey, William H. Westfall, and Nimrod L. Norton, had opened 3 years earlier and named Granite Mountain. The partners agreed to donate the sunset red granite outright, a color unlike any building stone yet quarried in Texas, on the condition that the state extend a rail line from Burnett out to the mountain and supply the labor to cut it. The legislature agreed to both terms. The labor it supplied was convict labor, sentenced men swinging hammers under armed guard for a monument they would never be permitted to enter. By the time the work was finished, more than 15,000 railroad carloads of granite had moved north along that spur. What rose from that stone cost the state $3.7 million, paid not from the Treasury, but from 3 million acres of panhandle land, signed over to the contractors. Land the state could spare more easily than cash. The building climbed higher than its architects had first drawn it, and higher, when finished, than the United States Capitol in Washington, a fact the legislature noted with quiet satisfaction. Red granite walls rose over a limestone base, quarried closer to town. A color Texas had never before put on a building this size. Scaffolding climbed with the walls. Cranes climbed with the scaffolding. By the winter of 1888, only the dome stood unfinished, open at its crown, waiting for the one piece that would make the building legible from every direction at once. That piece arrived in February 1888. A zinc statue nearly 16 feet tall and weighing more than 2,000 pounds, cast in Chicago and shipped south under canvas, her face kept secret until installation day. Newspapers had taken to calling her the Goddess of Liberty before anyone in Austin had seen her. Workers rigged block and tackle to the dome's iron frame, wrapped the statue in canvas slings, and began the climb in a wind strong enough to swing half a ton of zinc against the scaffolding with every gust. Below, the crowd on Congress Avenue could not yet see her face, only the shape of her moving upward, foot by foot, into a sky that had never before held anything built by Texans. She was still climbing when the sun went down. Chapter 3. Moonlight and the Flood. She reached the crown before the light gave out. Workers guided the last feet by touch, cinched the base to its mounting, and let the canvas fall away before a crowd that had held Congress Avenue since noon. The zinc face turned east, caught what remained of the sun, and threw it back over a city that had waited 40 years to own a monument taller than the Union it belonged to. The dome was finished. The statue was finished. Neither one, however, could do anything about the 6 or 7 hours after sunset when both vanished into the dark, along with everything else in Austin. The Capitol went black like any other building. That problem outlasted the statue by 6 years. Austin in the early 1890s still lit its streets the way most American towns did. Gas lamps at scattered corners. A lamplighter working block by block. Whole stretches of Congress Avenue, and everything east and west of it left to the dark once he had passed. The city council wanted electric light and could not afford to string it the way larger cities had begun to, pole by pole, wire by wire. Across a grid that had grown far past anything Edwin Waller had first surveyed. What it found instead in 1894 was a bargain built out of somebody else's failure. Detroit had spent the previous decade experimenting with towers instead of street lamps, iron masts strung with arc lights, meant to throw illumination down over whole districts at once rather than pooling it under individual poles. By 1894, the city had judged the design a failure and started tearing its own towers down, faster than it could find buyers for the iron. Austin bought 31 of them whole, shipped south still bearing the welds of a city that no longer wanted them, and raised them as if Detroit's verdict had never been rendered at all. Each tower stood 165 feet, taller than anything in the city save the Capitol dome itself, and carried 6 arc lamps wired to throw light across a radius of 1,500 feet. Not a street lamp's pool, but something closer to weather, a false moon lowered onto whichever ward happened to stand beneath it. Crews raised them through the winter of 1894 into the spring of 1895, tower after tower after tower, until no street in the platted city stood more than a few blocks from one of their circles of light. No alley was too far. No corner was too poor. No block waited on a lamplighter who might or might not finish his round before dawn. Austin had bought a rejected technology and built with it something Detroit never managed. Towers meant to outlast the very judgment that had condemned them. The current that fed them came in part from a dam the city had raised across the Colorado River and finished in 1893. Stone and timber meant to turn the river's fall into power, the way the granite quarry at Marble Falls had turned stone into a capital. It held for 7 years. On April 7, 1900, 17 inches of rain fell across the watershed above Austin in 48 hours, and the river the dam had been built to discipline stopped answering to it. The structure gave way in the night. 18 people were killed in the flood that followed, and close to 100 houses along the river's banks were destroyed before morning. The Moonlight towers kept their iron frames standing through the storm, unmoved and untouched, throwing no light at all, because the plant that powered them had gone into the river with everything else. Austin stayed dark, in the sections the dam had lit, for months afterward. 2 miles northeast of the wreckage, on the rise where the university's main building had opened without a finished roof 17 years earlier, the new semester was already being planned as though nothing along the river had happened at all. Chapter 4. The Quiet Decades and 96 Minutes. The semester opened as planned and closed, and opened again. And for the next 6 decades, Austin did this without much to distinguish one turn of the calendar from the next. There was no boom to match the Moonlight Tower's ambition, and no bus deep enough to empty the streets around the capital. Only the slow accumulation of a state government town and a college town going about their business, session after session, semester after semester, while the rest of the state built oil derricks and cattle empires around it. It was a city that filed things, appropriations bills, enrollment records, deed transfers. It was a city that built things without hurry. A dormitory here, a highway spur there, an office wing added to the Capitol grounds roughly on schedule. It was a city that waited through 2 world wars and a depression that gutted much of the rest of Texas for a distinction it had not yet earned. By the middle of the 20th century, Austin's population had still not reached 100,000. Among the buildings raised during those unremarkable decades was the University of Texas Tower, finished in the 1930s and rising 27 stories above the campus. Built, like the Capitol Dome and the Moonlight Towers before it, as a statement of ambition rather than necessity. It housed offices and a library collection. Its observation deck offered a view of the whole basin the city sat in, the river, the Capitol, the hills to the west. For 3 decades, it served exactly that purpose and no other. On the morning of August 1st, 1966, Charles Whitman, 25 years old, an engineering student at the university and a former United States Marine, killed his wife and his mother in their respective homes. Both killings are documented. No further account of them is required here. He then drove to the campus, carrying rifles and ammunition in a footlocker, and took the elevator to the 27th floor of the tower. He killed the receptionist at the reception desk of the observation deck and 2 visitors on the stairwell below it. Shortly before noon, he began firing down onto the campus and the streets surrounding it. For the next 96 minutes, Whitman fired from the deck at people below, students walking between classes, a police officer, a pregnant woman crossing the South Mall, a delivery boy on a bicycle 2 blocks away. He killed 16 people in total and wounded 31 more before an Austin police officer and a civilian volunteer reached the observation deck by way of the stairwell and killed him at 1:24 p.m. The siege had lasted 96 minutes. It remains, measured by duration and by the number of dead and wounded from a single position, the deadliest hour in the city's history. The tower had been built to announce what the university intended to become. For 96 minutes on an August afternoon, it announced something else, and the 2 buildings that had stood over Austin since its founding, the Capitol Dome to the south, the tower to the north, looked at each other across a campus that would not be the same distance from either of them again. By evening, the dead had been named, the wounded counted, the deck closed. Austin's population, still short of the 6 figures it had spent 60 years failing to reach, would cross that mark within the decade, and cross it faster and by a margin larger than anything the quiet years before August 1st had prepared it for. Chapter 5. Silicon Hills. On July 31st, 1967, International Business Machines opened a 100,000 square foot plant in North Austin, built to manufacture the Selectric typewriter. IBM was the first major electronics manufacturer to gamble on the college town, and the gamble was narrow and specific. Not tax incentives, not cheap land alone, but the engineering graduates the University of Texas had been producing for decades, with nowhere adequate to send them. Texas Instruments followed by 1969, drawn by the identical calculus. The same faculty, the same curriculum, The same annual class of trained hands walking out of the same buildings that had, a generation earlier, produced mostly lawyers and legislators. Within 2 years, Austin held two of the largest names in American electronics, inside an economy that had run, since its founding, on government payrolls and tuition checks. The government and college town had acquired a second engine, quietly, without renaming itself. That second identity got its name in 1983 when a consortium of computer companies founded the Microelectronics and Computer Technology Corporation in Austin, a joint research venture assembled because no single firm could outspend the rising Japanese chip industry alone. MCC gave the city its first tech nickname, Silicon Hills, an echo and a challenge aimed 600 miles west at the valley the name was borrowed from. The hills, unlike the valley, came with a state legislature down the street and a public university supplying the labor at no premium. The nickname arrived before the population did, before the skyline did, before anyone outside the industry had reason to notice. It would take 13 more years to be earned in full. On May 3, 1984, in room 2713 of a University of Texas dormitory named Dobie Hall, a 19-year-old pre-med student named Michael Dell began assembling personal computers from stock parts, working with $1,000 in starting capital under the name PCs Limited. Dell had no engineering degree, no corporate backer, no laboratory, only a dorm room, a working theory that IBM-compatible machines could be built cheaper and sold direct, and the retail markup every established competitor assumed was unavoidable. By the second half of his freshman year, he had sold $80,000 worth of machines. No garage, no coastal pedigree, no venture syndicate waiting at the door, just a dormitory room, a folding table, and an order book that would not stop filling. 3 years later, in March 1987, a small conference organized by staff of the Austin Chronicle expected 150 people and drew 700 on its opening day. A local newspaper's staff put it together with none of the usual backing. No chip fabrication line, no federal grant, no consortium of IBM's rivals. Testing only whether the city could support a gathering built around music, film, and the interactive media the engineers 3 miles away were, at that same moment, trying to invent. It grew into South by Southwest, and within a few years it accomplished what IBM, Texas Instruments, and MCC together could not. It put Austin's name in front of an audience that had never heard of the Selectric, or Dell, or the Microelectronics and Computer Technology Corporation, and did not need to. In 1988, the federal government funneled roughly $870 million through a semiconductor research consortium called Semitech, headquartered in Austin, built to keep the American chip industry from losing permanent ground to Asia. It was the largest single vote of federal confidence the city's electronics sector had yet received. It arrived not because Austin had lobbied hardest, but because the infrastructure, the university, the existing manufacturers, the research culture MCC had already normalized, was standing and ready when Washington went looking for a home. The government town and the tech town had, by now, become difficult to separate. By 1996, the pattern read clearly enough that a conglomerate on the other side of the Pacific could follow it without a map. That year, Samsung broke ground on its first Austin semiconductor fabrication plant, the largest name yet to conclude that a city once defined by a Capitol dome and a limestone tower had become something the rest of the industry now had to reckon with. The ground had been broken. What got built on it, and what it would eventually cost, belonged to the years still ahead. Chapter 6. The Boom Nobody Could Stop. Over the following decades, Samsung invested more than $18 billion into that single Austin site, one of the largest direct foreign investments in American history. Clean rooms multiplied across ground that had been scrubland only years before. Wafer fabs rising where cattle had once grazed within sight of the highway. The single fabrication line that broke ground in 1996 grew into a manufacturing complex employing thousands, its output measured in silicon wafers shipped by the millions to buyers the plant's first engineers had never met and would never meet. Suppliers followed the money south, then their suppliers followed them, until an entire second economy had assembled itself around one company's decision to build here rather than somewhere else. Austin had asked for one factory. It received an industrial anchor that no longer moved. The technology base bent under pressure twice in the years that followed, and both times it held. The dot-com collapse of 2001 erased fortunes built on companies that had never turned a profit, taking entire office parks in Silicon Valley down with them. But Austin's did not go with them. The 2008 financial collapse seized credit systems worldwide and left cranes standing idle from Phoenix to Las Vegas. Austin's kept turning, because the money Samsung had already sunk into the ground here was not the kind a corporation walked away from twice. State government kept its payroll. The university kept its enrollment. Austin's economy, insulated by both, did not so much survive the decade as ignore it. In July 2020, Tesla broke ground on a 2,500-acre gigafactory along the Colorado River east of the city, an initial investment of $1.1 billion that Elon Musk said would eventually exceed $10 billion. Foundations went in through a Texas summer. Steel followed within months, rising fast enough that satellite photographs from consecutive quarters looked like they belonged to different buildings entirely. The following year, Tesla moved its corporate headquarters out of California altogether, relocating to Austin and confirming what Samsung had only implied 25 years earlier. Reporters who had once flown in to cover a groundbreaking now flew in to cover a departure from somewhere else. The company had stopped visiting Austin. It had started living there. The pandemic accelerated everything Samsung and Tesla had already set in motion. Austin became the single most searched moving destination in the United States, as remote workers and the companies employing them left coastal cities whose price tags no longer made sense against a laptop and a Wi-Fi connection. The median home listing price rose from $369,745 in April 2020 to $625,000 in April 2022, a 69% increase in 2 years that outpaced nearly every other metro area in the country. Moving trucks backed into driveways faster than the city could issue permits for the houses meant to receive them, and for sale signs came down within days of going up. Then, in February 2021, the story stopped being about money for a while. That month, Winter Storm Uri knocked out the Texas power grid for 4 days, cutting electricity to more than 4.5 million people across the state as temperatures fell into the single digits and stayed there. Pipes froze inside walls that had never been built for cold like that, then split when the thaw came. Water treatment plants failed. Texas later recorded 246 deaths from the storm. Independent estimates ran considerably higher. None of the counts included the households that simply went without heat, without water, and lived. In neighborhoods a few miles from the Capitol Dome, residents burned furniture and fence posts to keep children warm, melting snow on stovetops for water, while pipes split behind drywall they could not see or reach. Some households went more than 4 days without electricity in a city that had just finished a decade of never losing. No convoy of state generators arrived in time. No emergency order thawed a single pipe before it burst. No chapter of Austin's own history had ever asked its residents to do without power for that long. the infrastructure sold to Samsung and Tesla as limitless, endlessly scalable capacity had nothing left over for the people who already lived under it. The storm passed within a week. What it exposed about the city underneath the boom would take considerably longer to settle. Chapter 7. What the Boom Left Behind. The first sign was small. A corporate blog post dated early 2023 thanking Austin employees for their contributions before the layoffs began. Nothing about it announced itself as the end of anything. It read like routine corporate housekeeping, language written to be forgotten by the people who wrote it. It was not forgotten by the people who received it. By the end of that year, the companies that had raced to Austin began cutting back just as fast as they had arrived. Oracle, which had relocated its corporate headquarters to the city in December 2020 with the fanfare of a company staking a permanent claim, reduced its global workforce by between 25,000 and 30,000 positions, and then announced it was moving its headquarters again, this time out of Austin, 3 years after moving in. Tesla, whose Gigafactory groundbreaking had been treated as a civic holiday, laid off nearly 2,700 workers at that same site. Dell, an Austin company since 1984, cut roughly 13,000 jobs company-wide. Indeed, headquartered downtown in a tower that had become a fixture of the skyline, cut about 2,200. None of these companies left Texas. All of them, in the span of 18 months, took back a portion of what they had promised. The math of the boom ran in reverse. Median home prices, which had peaked near $550,000 in 2022, fell 18 to 20%, settling around $440,000 by late 2025. Houses that had sold in bidding wars sat on the market for months. Builders who had broken ground anticipating another decade of arrivals found themselves finishing subdivisions for buyers who were no longer arriving in the numbers the spreadsheets had assumed. The city that could not build fast enough in 2021 had, by 2024, more inventory than it knew what to do with. It was not a collapse, it was a correction. And corrections do not make headlines the way booms do. They simply happen month after month in numbers that people stop mentioning at dinner. What did not correct was the population the boom had priced out along the way. An estimated 6,235 people were experiencing homelessness in Austin as of May 2024, living in a city that had spent a decade becoming one of the most expensive in the state it once defined itself against. The city's answer was not shelter. It was enforcement. Under a public camping ban approved by voters in 2021, Austin issued nearly 1,300 citations in the years that followed, a paper trail of infractions handed to people who had nowhere the ordinance permitted them to be. The tents moved from one underpass to the next. The citations accumulated in filing cabinets. The people they were issued to remained, for the most part, exactly where they had been. There was a boom that filled the skyline with cranes, and a boom that filled the balance sheets of companies 6 states away, and a boom that never once touched the man asleep under an overpass on Riverside Drive. 3 booms, 1 city, and only one of them was visible from the observation deck of a downtown tower. The people who had moved to Austin for its affordability, its promise of more house for less money, its status as the exception to every rule the coasts had written, discovered by 2024 that the exception had expired. The city had not become San Francisco. It had become something else, something with a lower ceiling and a longer memory, a place that had oversold itself once, spectacularly, and was now living through the bill. Cranes still worked downtown. Data centers still hummed on the outskirts, drawing more power each year than anything the city's founders had built for. But the certainty was gone, replaced by something more ordinary, a city doing arithmetic instead of making promises. What remained after the layoffs and the price corrections and the citations handed to men with no address to write on the form was not the Austin of the pitch decks. It was a city built in a hurry, on assumptions that had not all survived contact with 2023, still standing, still growing, still counting what it had left. End. Chapter 8. The Inventory. What remained also asked eventually to be counted, The way any city that has been built and unbuilt and rebuilt gets counted in the end. Not in the pitch deck numbers this time, but in the objects still standing after the money moved on. 17 of the 31 Moonlight towers that Austin bought secondhand from Detroit in 1894 are still bolted into their footings, still switched on every evening, throwing down the same pale, shadowless light that once let a frontier town claim it had made its streets safe after dark. The light has been converted and reconverted. Since, the fixtures changed, the wiring redone more than once. What has not changed is that the towers are still there, roughly 130 years on, doing a job nobody has formally asked them to keep doing. Near downtown, one of them rises over an intersection, its 4 steel legs planted in a small fenced square of grass between a parking garage and a bus stop, indifferent to both. Commuters wait under it without looking up. It was built to answer a fear specific to 1895, and the fear is long gone, and the tower stayed anyway, lit each night for reasons that have nothing left to do with safety, and everything to do with the fact that removing it was never anyone's job either. The Capitol Dome still stands at the top of Congress Avenue, and the Goddess of Liberty still balances on top of it, sword in one hand, star held out in the other, facing south over a skyline that has grown far taller and closer around her than the men who raised her statue ever planned for. Cranes have come and gone within sight of her for 140 years. She has outlasted the cattle drives, the railroad men, the university's early poverty, the freeze that killed the power grid, and every boom that promised to be the last one Austin would ever need. She has not moved. Everything around her has. The Colorado River still runs the same course it always ran, past the dam that made Town Lake possible, past downtown, and on south past 2,500 acres of poured concrete, where a company that did not exist a generation ago now builds electric vehicles under a roof visible from the interstate. The river floods that stretch of ground on its own schedule, not the company's, the way it always has. It does not care what is built beside it. It has never cared. In 2000, a resident named Red Wasenick called a local radio station, Coop, and used the phrase "Keep Austin Weird" on the air, trying to name something he thought the city was in danger of losing. The owners of 2 independent businesses, Book People and Waterloo Records, printed 5,000 bumper stickers with the phrase and gave them away, hoping to keep a national chain bookstore from opening downtown among them. The phrase spread faster than the campaign did. It outlived the specific fight it was made for, and it is sold today printed on official city merchandise, in shops that stock it on shelves beside the national brand goods it was coined to keep out. The stickers are still visible on bumpers around the city, faded, some of them 30 years old, parked next to cars that were not built in Texas and never will be. A Moonlight tower stands tonight at the edge of a parking lot off South Congress. 130 years old, its cables still strung between 3 iron masts, the way they were strung when Grover Cleveland was president. Its light is a pale white gray, not gold, and it falls without casting much of a shadow at all, the way it always has. Underneath it, a line of electric scooters sits chained to a rack, charging. The tower was built to make a raw, unfinished town feel less afraid of its own dark. It is still switched on every night, over a city that finished building itself into something the tower's builders could not have pictured, and it still throws the same even, colorless light down onto the pavement below it.